Minnis podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Minnis podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. Today on the show, I am so excited to share the most unique book I've ever read on anti-racism and the healing of internalized racism for people of the global majority, who in North America we often call BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So, I've read a lot of books on anti-racism, and I don't say what I'm about to say to be braggadocious. I say this to put my praise of the book we're talking about today in its rightful context. Because when you hear what it is, like you may not believe me, or at least you may not take it as seriously as I hope you will. So before the George Floyd revolution in 2020, I had already read My Grandmother's Hands. I'd, done the book club and the practice groups and some of the workshops that Resmaa Menakem offered around that. And before that, at the time that Tamir Rice was murdered, I was reading They Call Me Number One by Bev Sellers. And prior to attending the Truth and Reconciliation public hearings of survivors' testimonies about Indian residential schools back in 2012, I had already read Lee Maricle's I Am Woman. I read that in first year university, so it was 1990s. I am a voracious reader. I always have been. And I'd say I've done a pretty fair literature review on colonialism, the construction of race and whiteness, supremacy and its fragilities, racism, anti-Blackness, colorism. Before I started recording, I just walked out to my bookshelf and I counted 49 anti-colonial or anti-racist titles. So that's not counting audiobooks, ebooks, essays, books I've loaned out or given away. So again, I'm not bragging. I just want you to put this in context. When I tell you that a tarot book is one of the best anti-racism workbooks I've ever come across, I hope you take note. I hope it piques your interest. I honestly think that if anyone, whether an adept or a newer student of anti-racism, were to pick up this book, it would keep them busy with exercises and practices and food for thought for the rest of their lives. And not incidentally, it would help them forge a deeper relationship with their tarot practice. So the book is called Tarot for the Hard Work, an archetypal journey to confront racism and inspire collective healing. The author and my guest today is the lovely Maria Minnis. Maria is a tarot reader who teaches about blending spirituality with liberation work. She has creatively worked with tarot for over 20 years and considers herself an eternal student of life and thus the tarot. Her community program, Anti-Racist Tarot Society, is inspired by her belief that the end result of all magic should be to cultivate a more equitable and empathetic planet. Tarot for the Hard Work is a provocative exploration of the 22 cards of the major arcana that re-envisions these archetypes as beacons that illuminate the various ways that racism takes root both in ourselves and in the world. With exercises and thought-provoking recommended reading and resources, readers are guided to use major arcana themes to dismantle internalized racism, racism in your relationships, and racism in your communities. This book exceeded my expectations, and I hope you're already Googling where you can buy it because it's a keeper. I am delighted to welcome to the show Maria Minnis. So Maria, welcome. What identities do you lead with?
Hello, thank you for the warm welcome. I am unapologetically Black and queer. I am proudly autistic, and I show up wherever I am as authentically as I try to be as a writer, an advocate, and a friend.
Mm. Your book, Tarot for the Hard Work, has been so eye-opening to me in terms of how deep and how broad a scope a book on tarot can have, how transformative, what a force for justice it can be. It's like nothing I've read in this space. Tell me how and when the tarot first came into your life.
Yes, I was gifted a deck, the Heindel deck, way back like 20 years ago, or I guess now a little longer, a little more than that. And I did not take the traditional route. Uh, I didn't really understand the meanings to the cards in the sense that is carried on by the dominant narrative. Um, I initially started with a more intuitive approach to the cards. I would, lay the spread down and I would weave a story because I'm not a fiction writer, but I do think that stories create the worlds that we inhabit and create. So I love creating stories out of tarot, rather than just, picking up one individual card, compartmentalizing its meaning, and then moving on. I think there's a place for both approaches. But anyway, so I developed my own relationships with the cards, and years later, I became, very familiar with, like I described earlier, like the dominant descriptions of each card. And that I think that sometimes we have, because of the state of things in this world, we have a negative connotation with the word dominant. But I mean it very literally here. I think that there is a lot of value in having your own intimate relationship with the cards that is constantly evolving as you evolve and the world evolves. But I also think it's really important to understand the more collective meanings and energies of each archetype because the tarot doesn't exist without people, and the archetypes model um, human existence from so many different facets. And the stories, we're going back to stories, the stories that people have told about the cards and with the cards are in our, you know, collective dialogue or collective uh, conversations about each card. Like we have this shared language, and there is a lot of value in having a shared language as a basis from which we can have important conversations and kick off, important actions. So that's where I started. And then I read for people for fun at parties and events. And I eventually professionalized my business. I say business, but it's a lot more fun and exciting and interesting than that word connotes. Um, but I started my business in 2017, and I have just been so lucky since to be able to have connected with people who trust me to, spend an hour with them and listen to um, their innermost feelings or their concerns. Like it's quite an honor to me. And because I have done readings for so many people, I have a really complex relationship with a lot of, all of the cards. And so that's sort of why I could conceptualize something like using the cards to represent social justice actions, for
Mm.
example.
Hmm. Well, and you have a story yourself that's almost a little bit like it echoes the golden age of the internet in the sense that your blog formed the basis of a book, which is like a pretty amazing. Um, it's just it it's like fairy tale for a lot of people who are working in that kind of intuitive art, to be like, wow, and then I put something out into the world and it like gained that kind of collective traction. It's such a beautiful thing. But actually, before we move on, what you were just describing about having an intuitive approach to the cards is so wonderful. And I think important for people to know that for most of the history of the tarot, that's how they were treated. The idea of having like a little
Hmm.
book that comes with the deck, or even the pictorial key to the tarot by Eden Gray, these are like 20th century phenomenon. Like until less than 100 years ago, people were just getting a deck of cards and going like, what does this story tell? So I love that the genesis of your work is very much aligned with the genesis of the tarot in that way, in terms of how it's been transmitted. But it must have been really
Yes.
difficult material for you to write at times. It's a tremendous amount of emotional labor to educate people about racism, ableism, classism, systems of oppression. So for you personally, what spiritual purpose or what healing step did it serve for you to write tarot for the hard book, for the hard work?
One, I want to thank you for acknowledging the emotional labor that went into this project, because it was immense. And part of that labor, that work that I had to do was confronting my own um, internalized biases, just by nature of having always lived in the United States and having grown up in a very conservative, white, rural area. And I did not like some of the things that I came up against. Um, I I'm blanking on examples, but or actually I can think of one like code switching, for example. Like I on one hand, like I realized like before, um, or in the past, I have been like, I have to, speak this way or present this way to whatever dominating forces I'm interacting with. A lot of the times it's like white workplaces or, um, mostly able-bodied environments, for example, like having to like compartmentalize a part of myself in order to get ahead. And I realized how much that conflicts with my perspectives around respectability politics, and how if I am safe in doing so, then I shouldn't care how quote unquote black I show up in a place. And I say black with quotation marks, because I'm speaking to others like stereotypical depictions of black people. And that was a really hard thing for me to reconcile, because it's like on one hand, yes, I want to quote unquote get ahead. I want a roof over my head. I want to be able to travel and enjoy my life. And I have the privilege of being able to do so. But what's more important for me is cultivating spaces where people can be authentically themselves. And because I am privileged in certain ways, I am well primed to take a risk in, showing up as my authentic self as a model for other people. And that's sort of where I've come from that as a result. And it, I think it sort of illustrates what I communicate in the book around, how do I describe this? Around letting go of your privilege and having to lose convenience, time, money, etc., affiliations, and other privileges in order to offer others privileges and greater abilities to not just survive but thrive in this world. And so I had to confront that, like, yes, I may be Black and, I might have, you know, I might be autistic and have all of these different intersections. I'm a woman, I'm, queer, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I still have, I have a few degrees and I have, a stable roof over my head. I have job security. These are privileges that I have that I have to leverage for the to help rise the tide of people who have less than me or less power in our society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm gonna like bring the listeners in to the fact that you and I were previously talking about moral injury before we started. And so it's just echoing in my mind right now that in order, let me put it differently, it costs to be able to do this hard work because you have to recognize your biases, but then if you don't take action on that, it's a morally injurious event to yourself because
Yes.
you have, and so even though it does cost you something to distribute your power or give up your privileges or recognize your advantage and step aside or speak up as needed, the thing that it gives you is the richness and the coherence of living in accordance with your personal values and like living a meaningful life. So it's I mean, you called it tarot for the hard work for a reason, right? Like it's hard work, but that also implies that there's this rich reward, which I really appreciate. Yeah, your book, honestly, I mean, there's just it's a handbook for living. It's really quite amazing. So I had a hard time figuring out like how to contain the scope of your book and like the importance of it in questions. So what I did was I went to my tarot deck and was like, okay, so I'm going to pull some cards and these will be like topic areas for questions. And like I died when I saw what I pulled because I was like, wow, so this is like pretty intense. It's taking us right into it. Personally, as a Scorpio sun, I didn't have a problem with these, but I will just say, so the first card I drew was the Hermit card. I mean, I can remember clients from years ago when tarot reading was my primary modality who like really getting that card was like so devastating for them. So I have my own sort of emotional imprint with that card. The Death card. Also, I drew again, my Scorpio self has no problems with this card, but a lot of people kind of get rattled with that. The Temperance card came up, which I felt kind of called out by because last year was my year of the Temperance card. That was like the card I pulled for my year. So I feel like I've really lived with those messages. I love that card. And then finally, the Devil card. I was like, wow, it's like this book is channeling through this deck right now.
Wow.
So yeah, it was awesome though. So let's start with the Hermit. You open the Hermit chapter by writing, the hermit deepens their intimacy with themselves to deepen their intimacy with the world. I love that line. It's so great. So, what would you say the hermit has to teach us about liberation work?
I think we could sum it up in some sort of way as the recognition that we are, we have more quote unquote power um, that we often recognize. The hermit, often we talk about how there's this direct, connection with the divine. Like you go up to the mountain, you don't have a ton of tools or anything. Like it's your connection with the beyond or your intuition or your inner child, etc. And so while I'm not really speaking about liberation work as in like going to the top of the mountain and speaking to your inner child, I or like connecting with divine power or whatever. I think there is an inherent divinity in all of us, which is very powerful. And when we move alongside the hermit, I think we learn to be able to trust in our own abilities to affect change without the need of like fancy tools and the baubles, etc., etc. Because I think a lot of times when we confront like liberation work, we feel like, okay, I've got to read all these books. I've got to know the terminology. I've got to, have a grasp on all of these things, like all this preparatory work. But eventually it's just you and the problem, like you can't, like you're never going to be 100% ready, but you are always 100% capable.
Mm.
That does not mean you are capable of doing everything, but you are capable of doing something.
Absolutely. I think sometimes people get afraid of the hermit card because of the loneliness it implies, right? That there's a solitude there. And I think that's a true thing too in liberation is that like if you're going to stick your neck out a bit, yeah, like there's going to be losses or you will feel alone or you will feel alienated outside of social norms for sure. There's an isolating quality to it. But when you look at the image of the hermit who has the star inside the lantern, you know, it's also a beacon. So there's this kind of quality of the hermit, like you say, like you do have the capacity to stand in your personal power and stand in your values and just shine that from that place and be the beacon that attracts people to you and attracts them to that way of thinking that yeah, it does feel liberatory, but there can be some solitude on the path for sure.
For sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. And I also say that the hermit always comes back to the world. The hermit always turns their back and returns to the mundane, the everyday life. And like you said, I love that you used the word beacon. Like after realizing your own strengths and potential, that emanates in how you show up in the world. And what you do ripples out, and you can model um, the things that you want to see in the world a little bit better because you're a little bit more confident in doing so.
For sure. Okay, so let's move on to the death card. I often think of the death card as, purely about transformation, but I would love to hear you tell us a bit about the death card and how the death archetype can support us.
Yes, I think the death card, even though it's not adjacent to the devil card, I think that the death card is still sort of a prelude to the devil card. We have to clear away our, you know, we have to get rid of some of our privileges or we have to reduce them. We have to we have to get rid of the unnecessary, and that isn't just privilege, that's also like self-doubt and other things that are standing in your way of you being able to show up in the way that you as the hermit proved to yourself or told to yourself. Because if you don't do that work, then you get to the devil and then you realize like like the things you let go with the death card, what's remaining can often show up as an addiction. And that's, a word sometimes we associate with the devil or the devil card. I always get them mixed up. Like 5 letters start with D, E. Um, anyway, so yeah, addictions can be associated with the devil card, which in some decks is called vice. And I think that might be a little bit more resonant in liberation work, because the death card asks you to take stock, and you get the freedom to like pick and choose, and you have the spaciousness with the death card. And with the devil card, it's like the devil card is the first card in the third line of the major arcana if we do a 3-line grid. And that essentially tells us that the devil card can be the gateway to this third line of the tarot, which is about like, the transpersonal experience, the transcendence, the work that you do that flows into the collective, etc. So with the death card, I just, in the book, I offer a lot of different perspectives, but the one that's really resonating with me right now is the sort of call to take advantage of the space that you have to analyze, clear away the clutter, so you can really get to, get deep in your work.
Well, and I think you're speaking to something that is underneath people's fear of the death card is I think they do feel kind of powerless, like, oh shit, something is going to happen or something's coming and I don't have a lot of choice. So I'm curious, like, what are some of the magical practices you would recommend to conjure this card, or like maybe what's some of the remediation you would do if people get this card and they want to come closer to the gifts of the death card?
Yes. You know, one thing that is promised to all of us is the inevitability of change. And so this card, that transformation, is sort of like I sometimes recall the Wheel of Fortune card and this message of like the wheel's going to turn regardless. You can, you know, stand in front of it and try to resist it, or you can just go with the flow. And so with the death card, it's like, okay, death is coming, the death of, something from the past, something perhaps from your current life that, needs to be cleared away. And when you clear things away, on the other end of that is liberation. On the other end of that is a fresh new seed, opportunity, potential, spaciousness. And, that's why we've got the temperance card in between the death card and the devil card. The major arcana does not end with the death card. The real gifts, the most, I think, exciting gifts of the major arcana come later, after this, second line of deep inner work. So I invite people to think about the death card as an opportunity to change for the better. And like that does mean that you may have to deal with how uncomfortable change is, but change is going to happen regardless. So what are you going to do about it?
So we've invoked the muse of the temperance card, which is like this kind of beautiful moment of, I consider like respite in this like challenging line. So about this card, you say, this story asks, what survives after death? So when the temperance card comes up in a reading, how might we see that mirrored in our life? And how might that show up in the work of dismantling systems of oppression?
Yes, I often prefer to call this card art. And I think that that sort of resonates with me a lot because after death, we've got all of these like remaining pieces that can often be sort of disparate. Um, with the Temperance card, we have this opportunity to take all of those materials and paint or collage our concept of, our own lives and how we show up. And I think of the Temperance card as the ultimate magician, like the magician squared somehow. Um, this being that takes all of these different pieces and tempers them in order to create a sense of peace and stability and understanding of what's left. And the temperance card, you know, oftentimes we say it's about balance, but oftentimes in our world, we don't get perfect balance or perfect fairness, but we can still strive for clarity, peace, rest. I think rest is a big part of this card that we often wait to the star to talk about, which I think is unfortunate because rest is, you know, should be integrated in every step of the fool's journey, I think. Um, and anyway, so the temperance card, I think, in terms of liberation work, can show up. I'm thinking of a lot of different things, but honestly, I'm thinking about people who put together different elements to create new things. And that connects me with, the idea of like art and how art can show up in social movements to create change and to connect with people whose learning modalities might not necessarily be, preferred learning modality may not be like reading books or articles. There are some things that cannot be articulated in just a sentence. Some things, in order to express the the full concept or idea or expression of something, it might have to be expressed with music in the background or
Mhm.
through street art. There have been so many examples in the past of how art has um, supported different movements, different liberation movements in so many unique ways. And I think the Temperance card is kind of an invitation to elevate those, um, you know, uh, those artists' work and to share them, share their work in order to sort of add more color to liberation work. It doesn't always have to be, writing op-eds for your local newspaper or, doing all the admin stuff. It can be doing that stuff while listening to music or doing something completely else. I think it's a reminder to show up with this collage of yourself, however that shows up, and understand that you have so many different facets of yourself to offer the movement, and you can put the different movements and you can put those different facets together in different ways that sort of ends up with a collage of a very unique way how you can show up for the things you believe in.
Oh, yeah. I'm thinking about uh, protest songs by, the Bangsons and Adrienne Marie Brown. And I'm thinking of murals, Banksy having a mural in Gaza, those kinds of things. I'm thinking
Hmm.
of all the ways that, like when you see the Mennonites singing at the Capitol and things like that, it's like, wow, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's amazing. And you said the word integrate. The temperance card really, it does have the integration vibe, doesn't it? It kind of has like a bit of a post-workout vibe. of like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't mean to rely so heavily on the linear progression of the major arcana because I think that, it's not always that linear. It doesn't always have to go from one to two to three, etc. Um, I think that though still I really love talking about the three lines of the major arcana, and the temperance is at the end of the second line, which is largely about deep inner work. And so there is that integration sort of energy before we move into, the devil, where, we've paused, we've taken stock of what's left after the devil, we've put that together. What are the remaining anomalies? What are the things that don't fit into this collage of what we want to, consider ourselves as? What's left? What are the, stragglers, the things that are are not congruent with how you want to show up for yourself and other people. So I
Mhm.
love the integrative aspect of the temperance card, and I think it's a topic that I'd love to, talk more about or have other people talk more about because it's really, really powerful.
Mm-hmm. So in the Devil chapter, in the section called Decentering White Feelings, you write, when anti-racism becomes uncomfortable for white people, some drop off, focus on low effort, high convenience work, fall back into old habits, or return to more insular motivations. So I think we can see this right now with like political fatigue and burnout, keeping up momentum in the opposition to multiple genocides in the world, specifically the one in Gaza that we're seeing so vividly on phones in the lead up to an American election after having gone through, we're in year 5 of pandemic, all the attacks on body sovereignty of women and trans and non-binary folks, climate chaos raging. Like it's immense and it's intense and it's very confronting. You also write, keep yourself in check and watch the center. So, which actions would you say the devil card can inspire us to investigate in order to manage this habit or tendency, let's say, of losing steam for the mission and like losing track of our center?
Right. Yes. That's a really great question. And I invite people to periodically check in with themselves and sort of examine what their work is centering around, and to do so um, without, with as little filter as possible. And sometimes that may involve feedback from other people who have seen your work and how you show up. Um, when we talk about the devil card and losing steam when things get really hard, I think, you know, I think we could harken back to um, the temperance card and the understanding that you're this complete thing regardless, and that there are different parts of you that, you might need to lay to rest that are uncomfortable. Perhaps you have the privilege of like switching to a more ethical bank, for example. And that feels really hard for you because there's all, you've got to change all your auto payments and this and that. Um, and that something as like not that serious can trigger people to feel like, well, I'm not going to do this. Oh, I'm such a crappy activist, or whatever word you use to call yourself. um it's just like a slippery slope into just this idea that like, okay, I'll be a better I'll just say activist. I'll be better activist later. And the devil card has this sort of urgency to it. And I think with this archetype, we have an opportunity to really channel back to current applications of what we are doing and why it's important to let go of some conveniences or privileges, etc. We, unfortunately, for some people, the devil, how I speak about the devil card is, one way they can approach that is by confronting difficult to consume facts and news and stories. Some people need videos and photos. Um, I I cannot dictate what people should use to regain steam or momentum, but I can say that this work of liberation is urgent. Um, and the devil card is just like, if you want to get past here, you've got to do the work, you've got to recommit, and you've got to show up. You've got to take
Mhm.
that chain off your neck because it's loose enough for you to take off your neck. The devil reminds you that these
Mhm.
things that come up, these attachments, are not necessarily permanent, that you have the power to do with what you want with that chain. And
Mhm.
like, I'm just speaking back to, for example, the Rider Waite, Smith deck, and where we see those two human figures in chains, but the collars around their necks are pretty loose. They can let go anytime. Um, yeah. So, yeah, I think the devil card is just like, a reminder to stay committed and that you don't have to be addicted or tied to certain things if you don't want to. And I
Mhm.
say certain things because like, we live in reality. And, for example, like, if in order for you to afford like clothes for your child, like, you might shop on Amazon or so on and so forth. We're all just trying to do as little damage as possible. And so that's why I say certain things and certain attachments, because the reality is we live in this, late stage capitalism world that's, dominated by oppressive forces. And we can't do everything, but again, we can do something.
Mhm. Yeah, I can see how the devil card would be a good like pull-up card in the sense that like, yeah, we do need to discern between like taking mental health breaks and not, burning ourselves out in activism, let's say. But probably if you're getting the devil card, that's not what's happening. Like
Right.
there could be a certain amount of numbing or that sort of thing happening. So the devil card does, I like that you're using the word urgency with it because it does feel like it's trying to remind us of that like you actually have to do something. You have to take the chain off. Like it's loose, but it's not coming off by itself, right? So you
Yes.
also
Yes.
you say in the build a toolkit section of this chapter, it's so good. You have like a series of prompts to help people map police brutality. I'm curious if you think the devil card can offer any wisdom about abolishing the cop within. Like, particularly for white people, I noticed there's a tendency to do stuff like co-opt the language and tools of transformative justice, but they get used in service of like controlling and policing each other or like mobilizing sides in a personal dispute or in a like comment section or something like that of Instagram. And sometimes, it's like policing in the name of preventing harm or kind of like operationalizing reputation management in a community. And I don't experience this as much now, but I certainly know in the past like 3 or 4 years, that could be pretty intense in some online and like social media spaces. So, um, like, is the devil card one that you might recommend to help us with this urge to be punitive or the urgency to control and police each other? Or is there like another card that you might call in, like place on the altar to help us with that particular problem when it comes to like how we have been shaped by policing and controlling each other, some of us more than others? I'm talking to the white people.
Um, you know, another aspect of the devil card that that I didn't mention earlier is when you realize that you have these addictions or attachments or so on and so forth, there can be feelings of shame and guilt, and those those feelings I think can be productive to an extent. But when we stay there, um, that's another opportunity to lose steam, right? And so the devil card, another aspect of it is channeling like your inner wildness, like the one without rules, the one who's unashamed to be themselves and be, live in their authentic truth. Um, and so there's sort of this like, with those two concepts around the devil card, there's this sort of dance between, you know, feeling shame and then feeling the constriction of shame and the freedom of moving on. And I think that's sort of a way we can gently relate to and heal the cop, quote unquote, within this sort of punitive, we live in a very punitive culture. And just, I'm speaking as someone living in the US. Um, and that really seeps into a lot of our perceptions about ourselves. And, you can either berate yourself or you can accept where you are and find liberation from that point. Liberation might look like taking a step back and, thinking before moving on and acting in ways that, might have, negative, results. I feel like I'm saying, a lot, but I
Okay.
just like, I'm
But I
just so
do know.
passionate. Yeah, we get each other. um, yeah, so I think when we think about the devil and self-policing, self-policing on a basis that elevates an idea of the immaculate activist who lives their life in a consistently aligned way, like that person doesn't exist. No one lives their complete life from birth to death. um at least people who survive beyond the early years, and so on and so forth. But no one who lives and acts in the world ever lives their life any without harming other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's guilt around that and there's shame around that, for a lot of people. So anyway, to sum up, what I'm trying to say is like, shame and guilt, they are chains. They have a time and place, but eventually you have to take them off, and there is liberation on the other side of that. There is the freedom to change and continue to evolve.
Hmm. Well, and as you mentioned, like this is a card that's on the third line, and in just in getting to this point, inherent in getting to this point in the fool's journey is the promise of like a, a greater sense of knowing oneself and the will towards becoming your full self and being in your full humanity, which includes, being fallible and includes that connection to the divine, that inherent personal power that you talked about in the beginning. So, yeah, I like what you said about, and sometimes it's time to just move on from that and carry
Right,
on.
right. It's not all about you. You know,
Totally.
it's not all about you. Like there are things more important than your guilt. So feel
Yes, for
those
sure.
feelings. Don't deny how you truly feel, but take that and move on because you can't stay there if you aim to live in alignment with the world you want to create.
Hmm. Hmm. So the final question on the podcast is always the same. How do you, Maria, personally cope with grief and with rage?
I spent a lot, I would say that I spent a lot of the first 20, 25 years of my life I had a chip on my shoulder and I had a lot of rage. And I feel like where I am now, I have, I'm all raged out. And that's not to say I don't ever feel rage against many things that are happening in the world. But in terms of feeling that like inner body heat of just like, I want to like, punch my pillow or so on and so forth, that doesn't really happen to me. But I do feel in response to things that are happening out in the world, horrific things that are happening in the world, is, I have grief around those things more than I have rage. I I spend, I'll be very personal here. I spend plenty of time mourning people I would have never gotten a chance to ever meet. I hear their stories. A lot of times, the subjects of those stories are um, anonymous because, for example, we might not be able to identify a body or whatever. And I think about the fact that at one point, every single person was, a precious little baby. And it is very sad to me that because of things like war and genocide and harm, that we, those little babies don't get to have the opportunity to experience a more spacious life, a full life, a safe life. I mourn for people who are still alive and are in the tight grasp of oppression. And there are so many ways that that oppression shows up. And, sometimes I think about at any given point, someone is experiencing something horrific. And I just, out of nowhere, I just cry. And I don't know if I have a really clear answer around like, how do I deal with it? I think in a few seconds of like self-examination that I deal with it by trying to figure out some sort of action that I can do in response that's not always, you know, leaving my house or donating money. It might be having tough conversations with people. It might be organizing food delivery. It might be sharing resources to someone you know who is in trouble. I don't do those things for like a cookie. I don't expect recognition. You know, I don't often talk about the things that I do online. I have sort of a weird relationship with like the fact that I could post about something I did and people's response to it are likes. Um,
Mm.
and anyway, so I try to ground my grief in action because when I don't ground my grief, my mind will go everywhere. And like all of this thought is like essential to process, but it doesn't mean anything unless it translates into action, whether that's personal action or, you know, interpersonal action. It's got to, for me, it has to result in some sort of progression, even in the tiniest ways, um, because it's going to take a lot of tiny actions to affect big real change. It takes the everyday in order to transform the future every day. That's how I think I deal with that sort of grief. And
Mm.
it's very hard. And I, you know, try to set like social media boundaries, try to avoid certain websites when I know that like I'm not going to, uh, when I know that like I'm just not in the space to do that. But I do remain committed to staying abreast of topics, but I'm just very careful about how and when I, you know, approach the truth about the world, and being very cognizant of how I respond to that makes me feel like I have an anchor, a sense of, and a sense of power in a world that seeks to oppress that power in so many ways for so few people.
Mm. Mm. Well, some of how you have processed and made sense feels very temperance card to me, like the fact that you created this book, Tarot for the Hard Work, which just, I mean, I'll say it again. There are hundreds, maybe 1,000 actions, ideas, practices, exercises, things people can actually do for in this process of moving towards a liberatory future for everyone. Your book is just fabulously useful for that. So I highly recommend it to folks who are feeling stuck or like don't really know what to do and who would prefer something that's more artistic, that's more kind of a collage of many different things that has a transpersonal and healing aspect to it. I mean, what you've created is such an impactful piece of work. I'm excited to recommend it to people. I'm excited for everyone to explore it. It's a new classic, an instant classic in the of tarot. So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your ideas behind the work.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it's an honor to know that you're sharing this work with other people. It's my biggest spell to date. And if every single person who picked up this book did just one of those actions, I I would probably explode. But yes, I'm very grateful for this time together, and I am excited about what people around the world can do in response to what I've written.
What a genuinely wonderful person, as I said at the top of the show. I hope you've already Googled and found a place to catch a copy for yourself. But I will link, of course, to Tarot for the Hard Work in the show notes as well. And if you're a podcast player, which is like where you'd find those show notes, if it cuts them off, just go to numinouspodcast.com. So incidentally, one of the reasons I'm shifting my language away from the acronym BIPOC and towards the term people of the global majority is because of the Americentrism in the term BIPOC. And in Britain, for instance, their acronym is BAME for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. I don't know if they say it the way we say BIPOC. What would that be? BAME. BAME. Did they say BAME? I don't know. Anyway, my personal experience, though, of unhooking from supremacy cultures of all kinds, not just from whiteness, but also from human supremacy, for instance, it has been by far most profoundly influenced through direct relationship with First Nations folks in what we call Canada, as well as the education I received through books written by Indigenous authors, and not only those who write nonfiction, they write about the truth about intergenerational trauma from residential schools, but also the artists who are writing fiction, and also the other creators. So people like Thompson Highway, Richard Wagamese, Leanne Simpson, my friend Monique Grace Smith, the poetry and prose of Chief Dan George, the art of Roy Henry Vickers, and the stories of couch and knitters, and all the drummers and dancers and storytellers I've been lucky to witness, all the land-based knowledge about plants and waterways and seasons that's been shared with me by friends like Tiffany Joseph. Many of these folks that, or I shouldn't say many, but some folks that you've heard on the Numinous podcast, this is where my anti-colonialism, anti-racism education has truly come from. So personally, I'm pleased to have a phrase that refers to non-white people that doesn't center whiteness, of course, but it also doesn't erase or minimize any racialized experience. So I might still use the term BIPOC at times if, for some reason, I think it'll be more clear to the listener, to the audience. But, and I'm happy to use both for a while, BIPOC and people of the global majority at the same time for a few years until it kind of catches on. And that might sound a bit wordy or redundant, but that's okay. Language is always transitioning. I'm happy to help this one along. And this is my reason why. I just thought I'd let you know. This is my reason why I'm using people of the global majority. Everybody, people who are using that term, there may be a more academic reason for that, but that's me. That's my rationale. Because, the more you know, Gen X, the more you know. Okay, listener shout out today. This shout out goes to Anna in the Bahamas. I have spent time in the Bahamas when I was working as a private chef on mega yachts, also way back in the 90s. Really nice to have that memory brought up. Thanks, Anna, for your message in the podcast inbox. Anna writes, I love how you divided all your episodes into categories. I discovered your pod just a few weeks ago, and I want to devour all of the content, but of course have to prioritize since I can't listen for thousands of hours at a time. Too bad. This layout is super helpful. Yeah, so that's what I did. I'm going to look it up. It was a couple of episodes back, but I will link to it in this episode. It's the one that I called Podcast Playlist, because I don't know why podcast feeds, podcast hosts, how you publish your feed into the world, why won't they let us tag so that we can have categories? These are the themes I have. So anyway, I organized all my over 200 episodes into 14 different categories and just listed them out. Again, the show notes are so long that many podcast players you can't see it in, but I will link to numinouspodcast.com and that episode so you too can just browse the categories and listen to the archives based on your topic of interest. Thanks for that, Anna. I appreciate the feedback. You can leave me a note or leave me a voicemail at castfeedback.com/numinouspodcast. Cast feedback. So it's kind of like podcast, but they drop the pod. castfeedback.com/Numinous Podcast. Tell me which episode you're referring to and tell me what you think. I would love to hear it. The Numinous Podcast is a proud supporter of the People's Public Health Education Campaign. My friends, you have to live your life. Isn't that a thing that we've heard out on these internet streets or in the real world? You can't just be in pandemic forever. You have to live your life. I have to tell you that an awesome COVID resource website just dropped. It's youhavetoLiveYour.life. So just, I don't know, just like type that into your browser. youhavetoLiveYour.life, and it will take you to a website that has a drop down of common COVID, SARS-CoV-2 myths. And then when you click on it, in the drop down, it like takes you to a page that has a bunch of articles and scientific literature debunking that myth. So youhavetoLiveYour.life. It'll have, the drop down has stuff like, but doctors aren't wearing masks, or masks don't work or don't work very well. Or another one is, but the CDC says. And as I said, in the drop down of that myth, you click on it and it will have like a few articles and scholarly papers that debunk that myth. And I would say the articles are like not super up to date, but a lot of this information is old. I should say a lot of this misinformation is old and has been debunked a long time ago. So this is like more for your people who've just kind of stuck their head in the sand because they're like, I don't know, emotionally unequipped to let go of the old normal. I'm not saying the site will like transform their views, but if you're ever put on the spot and you hear someone say something like, you have to just live your life, and you need like a one-stop shop to provide receipts to someone, you know, if someone's like behaving like a wet cat, trying to get out of like every trick in the book to get out of this, like the reality of the situation, this could be a good resource for you. So wearing is caring, my friends. Here's your little factoid. Wear your N95 mask for yourself and others, because over 30% of SARS-CoV-2 infections are asymptomatic. Yes, I'll link to the meta-analysis in the show notes. Data from 2022 shows that precisely 32% of COVID infections are asymptomatic. So here's the scenario. You don't know you have it. They don't know they have it. We don't know how many people in this group have it. So if we follow the precautionary principle, who in this scenario should be wearing a mask? What's the most advantageous? Everyone. It was a trick. It's everyone. Wearing is caring, my friends. Wear your N95. Hey, last thing, I'm going to do a short course, new short course. It's coming out this summer sometime on moral injury. Moral injury is where you do or don't do, or you witness, or you hear about after the fact, something that egregiously violates your values in a high-stakes context. So this will be, I think, especially interesting to healthcare workers, any caregivers actually, folks working through their own trauma exposure response, like hello from witnessing genocides on our phones, people experiencing severe emotional burnout. But I promise not to overburden you with the course itself, right? It's going to be short, thought-provoking, but very pragmatic. So stay tuned to hear more about that by signing up for my newsletter. In the meantime, if you're a person who's going through any of the things I just named, we have support for you in the Numinous Network, like physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual practices to help you process vicarious trauma. Find out more about the Numinous Network and sign up for my newsletter at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.